Well, Siegfried Othmer, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, I'm happy to have the opportunity. I think this is a natural method for integrative psychiatry. And that's probably how it's going to enter psychiatry is through integrative psychiatry rather than through traditional pharmacology, the practice of pharmacology.
Right. Before we got started and started the tape here, we were talking a little bit about the challenges of penetrating the fortress, so to speak, of conventional points of view, and how difficult it can be to disrupt the paradigm. And you've had significant challenges along the way in doing that. And I want to thank you for your persistence and willingness to keep trying after all these years. And I can relate to some degree as an integrative psychiatrist and integrative psychiatry educator about how difficult it can be to walk into audiences and present things that don't fit with the conventional model. For example, I used to teach an integrative psychiatry course for the residents at the University of Colorado, and the course was canceled because of the complaint was the lack of evidence of the information that was being presented to the residents. And so, that was a minor, let's say, wound on the journey compared to some of the things that you faced. But maybe you could start with giving us a context of your journey with, what you've been working on with EEG and just the overall course of the shifts in your thinking and where you are today, where you started in the beginning.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe I'll start with where we started, just by way of introduction. I'm a physicist. My wife studied neurobiology at Cornell after getting her BA in physics, and really wanted to get into neurobiology. And so we had our first son while we were at Cornell, and he very quickly developed behavioral problems that got progressively more severe. And he was just sort of a mystery child. Nobody, no professional really understood what was going on. And of course, we as parents were only given a behavioral model, right? It was our problem to get this child to behave. And it really was not in his power. And so we put a very heavy trip on him. He says, Brian, you have to learn to behave. And at one point he says, well, I must just be an evil person because, he knew better than we did that he couldn't control his behavior. So he was thrown out of school at age 8, right? And this doesn't happen to ordinary children. And so long story short, this forced a reappraisal. Our pediatrician fortunately suspected a neurological involvement and started putting him on Dilantin and later on Tegretol. And that calmed his behavior to where it was manageable. It was still very difficult. They were still rages and so forth. And so life was not easy. It was that's what we lived with for 9 years. He went to high school in a special school, and then we came upon this neurofeedback, which actually had been discovered not very far from our house here, our home here in Sepulveda, in the San Fernando Valley, the Sepulveda Veterans Administration Hospital right here, and there was a practitioner in Beverly Hills, and we heard the story. My wife said, well, I'm coming. And sure enough, this turned out to be transformative for our son. We also did the training, and we all benefited. So we were immediately immersed in this. I said, well, this is powerful. Why does the world not know about this? This was all in the very shadow of UCLA Medical School, right? Beverly Hills is just right there. But basically the work was not accepted within neurology because it was a behavioral method. It wasn't going to go anywhere within neurology. So the literature, early literature, was all about epilepsy, and neurology wasn't paying attention. And then further development was in ADHD. So here we were confronted with this. And while our son was being treated, my wife, who again, was a neuroscientist, watched the comings and goings of other clients, head injured clients, people with total amnesia, children who couldn't speak. And she said, this is like Lourdes, my goodness. So the practitioner was emphasizing work with traumatic brain injury. And her frustration was that minor traumatic brain injury basically wasn't being accepted at that time. It was not taken seriously at that time. And so that actually gave her an opening because nobody was paying attention. No medical practitioner felt threatened because somebody down the street was working with traumatic brain injury. Those are people that nobody wanted to see if they still had symptoms years after the injury. Nobody knew what to do. So she basically made her reputation among people who had no medical recourse. And so we watched all this and said, oh my goodness, we just have to get involved because her instrumentation was primitive. Her knowledge of this was primitive. She had a master's in education. I mean, and yet she had hold of this powerful tool, right? Oh my goodness. So we got involved and formed a partnership that fell apart after a few years. And so then we were on our own. Okay. And this new instrument sat in our living room, and what now? So we got into this seriously, and then it developed. So what is this about? This is the core issue that's been neglected, I think, by practitioners, is this issue of neuroregulation. Simply our regulatory regime, which is hierarchically organized, and the top of it is of course our cerebral network. And so, here we are plowing this new ground that nobody else was paying attention to. And it's been quite wonderful.
Well, it really struck me when I was reading some of your work around orienting away from kind of the old Skinnerian perspective of basically, crude behavioralism. Toward this bottom-up regulation perspective and the neurological apparatus that has the task of regulating itself and struggles to do that. And the way that that you framed EEG as or I should say maybe neurofeedback, if that's the right term, correct me if I'm wrong, as a way for the brain to sort of reflect on its own capacities for self-regulation.
Right. So so what has gradually emerged, we started with this operant conditioning model, and that of course happened because the work originated with animal work, and so that the Skinnerian model was in vogue in the 1970s, and so that led, that was the way to get neurofeedback accepted was to basically use the tools that were already accepted, which is operant conditioning, and the early work was with cats and monkeys and so forth, and that put the technique on the map. Then when it emerged that this was actually possibly helpful with seizures, and that came out of the cat work. Then the interest shifted to human subjects, and the operant conditioning technique was simply transferred to human subjects, which sells the brain a little bit short.
Just a little bit.
Yeah. But we felt, again, this is science is often tethered to history. You want to be conservative in what you try. You want to have a theoretical basis for what you try, and so we were kind of tethered to the operant conditioning model for a while. But then we realized the brain is doing this faster than it should. If operant conditioning is the mechanism, it couldn't be happening this fast. Right. We were seeing single session effects with with infants that were, near drowning victims and so forth. I said, how is this even possible?
Mm.
And so we realized that somehow the brain is getting more information out of the signal that we're giving it than what we think we're providing. So, and that was the secret then to this new discovery, which is just, that the brain was actually taking charge of the process. We thought we were in charge, giving the brain the proper feedback, and the brain says, actually, I'm looking over here, And what happened is that the brain it was looking at the dynamics of the EEG rather than just these occasional discrete rewards. You're getting rewarded for doing the right thing in the last 3 seconds. Which is hard for the brain to figure out. It's hard for the brain to get the correlation. But of course, when it's looking at its own dynamics, then it says, well, that's just my dance. That's me. I recognize that. And now that didn't have to be the case, but it was the case. The brain recognizes its own EEG as self. And now this leads to neurofeedback in what's basically a skill building model, mm-hmm. where, by analogy to the development of motor skills, it's the best example. So a dancer looking at herself in the full length mirror at the studio is engaged with her reflection. And adjusting her movements and so forth. But of course, the brain underneath it all is doing this and is refining the movements, beneath the level of consciousness. And so the secret is that the brain has to see itself performing the skill in order to enhance the skill, whether that's playing the violin, shooting baskets, or whatever, or golf, putting. So the brain has to just keep seeing itself perform in order to improve its own skill, and all of that is beneath voluntary control. So here we, yeah.
So then the EEG pattern or the responses back to the brain from in real time from what's being measured is the mirror in the analogy. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the mirror. So the EEG is basically reflecting back to the brain. It's in real time. It's dance at this frequency, and now it turns out any frequency provides information to the brain. But then the next the next discovery was that some frequencies are more equal than others. So that's then another core organizing principle that the brain underneath it all, if you look at the EEG spectrum, it's all the frequencies are there, but right. But some frequencies seem to be what the brain uses to organize the entire frequency spectrum, and nobody had any reason to think that this existed, right? In fact, it's not. It's not in the literature except where we put it there. No one else is talking about this. There's actually a theoretical paper out of a British journal, philosophical journal, that entirely theoretical, which ends up, aligning with our model. But there's no other no other paper out there on this topic. So we have these special frequencies which we zero in on, and then the brain gets more information out of that, because those are the frequencies that it uses to organize the whole frequency domain in our understanding at this time.
So let me ask you a couple questions there, because I am one of the more ignorant people maybe in the audience. I don't know how much people know about the frequencies. I'm familiar with the standard ones, alpha, beta, theta, delta, or I should probably say beta, alpha, theta, delta in that order. Yeah. But when you talk about a frequency that sort of organizes the other frequencies, can you tell us more about that? What is that? Are we talking about gamma frequency? Are we talking about, what are we talking about exactly?
Right. So the fundamental division is this, that basically the EEG range organizes the dance that we execute in real life. Our activity, movement, and thinking, and so forth. So that's the text of our lives. The EEG organizes the text of our lives. But then there's the context. What state are we in as we are watching the movie, as we're watching a ball game, as we are engaged? What is the state of our autonomic nervous system, et cetera. And those are steady state. Those things move slowly, right? They're capable of responding fast in emergency situations, but by and large, they hang out in relatively stable form.
Right.
And that's us. We know ourselves to be either very stable or maybe a little volatile. That has to do with that low frequency domain. So this is the low frequencies way beneath the EEG. Now, it turns out, you see, that signal is much bigger than the EEG. And so, but people, of course, were interested in the EEG. So what do? Well, very easy. You just throw all that stuff away. You filter it out. You just ignore all the low frequencies. So basically, in the neuroscientists, the few neuroscientists that existed back in the 60s, they were studying this stuff, but then it fell into basically into a black hole. Nobody studied this anymore. People focused on the EEG and ignored all that stuff that was below there. And then in the 60s, this was from the 30s to the 60s. In the 60s, then there were a few revisits of the slow regime through the contingent negative variation and that kind of things, evoke potentials. But that again was transient behavior, right? Which refers to our EEG range. It did not bite into the apple, which is this low frequency regime, which governs where our nervous system hangs out. Right. And so it turns out that this is really the field, the domain that is of greatest interest therapeutically. The EEG, yes, we can train cognitive function, we can train vigilance and attention and learning disabilities and stuff like that, lots of things. But the core issues of whether our nervous system is stable or resilient and responsive and so forth, that's at the organized at the low frequencies. And so what happened is over this course of 30 years that my wife is doing this, and this is really my wife's story, she's the neuroscientist, and I just get to write about it because I have the PhD. It was a gradual emergence of the realization that pay dirt was actually at the low frequency. So it was a slow march. Once we realized these special frequencies exist, we were looking for them with every client. And turns out the most challenging clients tended to have the lower frequencies that were pay dirt for them. And so eventually we were bumping down to where the EEG runs, EEG instrumentation runs out, which is a 0.5 hertz, maybe 0.1 hertz. And so things run out of steam at about 0.1 hertz. What to do? Well, you get rid of those filters that throw away all that lovely signal down below 0.1. So we really are in the low frequency regime. I mean, less than 0.1, 0.01 hertz, that kind of thing. Wow. So now you've got this slowly varying signal that would bore anybody to death, so what do you do with it? How do you reinforce that? And so we were basically forced into the kind of feedback we're doing now, which we call endogenous neuromodulation, which is where the brain simply watches the signal, because after all, that's its dance. And the brain is, cannot lose interest, because once it's recognized that signal belongs to me, then it assumes responsibility for that signal, right? It owns it. It says, okay, well, now I have to pay attention. It naturally assumes responsibility. And an analogy here is our driving a car, for example, and we turn the driving over, the handling of the steering wheel over to our brains, right? We're
Right.
We're not worrying about which way the car is pointed. The brain is taking care of that in subroutine.
Sure.
And so boredom doesn't enter in. As long as the brain, is awake and alert, it will do that. And we don't have to, reward it. We don't have to instruct it, whatever. The brain says, okay, I got the job of keeping you alive. And so by the same token, if we give it this low frequency signal and feedback, we might be bored with it, but the brain says, yeah, but that's me. And so, and if we tune into these special frequencies, then the brain is really interested because working with it is very effective. And then this keeps going. This keeps going. There's a hierarchy of frequencies, and it turns out that when we're dealing with the most challenging clients, trauma cases and head injury cases and so forth, that might take us to very low frequencies indeed. And it's very specific. You change the frequency a little bit, and they'll tell you that they're unhappy, and then you change back to the right frequency. In fact, the only evidence we have of the right frequency is what that client tells us. He says, I feel better at this frequency. Okay, then we'll train there.
Interesting. Wow. So very personalized, very individualized treatments. And it sounds like you're not, other than the feedback of this feels better, or I feel a little better in this frequency, you're not training in any kind of traditional neurofeedback sense, like you were saying about the higher frequencies or cognition, et cetera.
Right. There are no overt reinforcements. There's another element that is traditionally present in neurofeedback, which is called inhibit-based training. So when the brain goes out of line in the EEG range, and you have these bursts of inappropriate activity, then traditionally in neurofeedback, we call the brain's attention to that as sort of a cueing to its indiscretions, to its slight momentary excursions into dysregulation. And so that remains true. So that we still gives the brain these cues with respect to these transient excursions into dysregulated states that are observable in the EEG range. But the meat of the thing, of the whole treatment, occurs at this low frequency range.
And I would gather, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, it's just a guess, that when we're talking about training at this ultra low, or I guess you would say infra low frequency, you're not, it's a very different, it's just kind of landing on me how different this paradigm is from working at the higher frequencies to train different things. You're not working with a database of a so-called, normal pattern. You're really working with what actually feels more regulated for that individual at that frequency.
Right. And let me just pick up on that. You see, the fact is that even when we were working in the EEG range, for a couple of decades, we were not relying on brain maps. We were always doing mechanisms-based training, which is basically, functional neuroanatomy was telling us where would be a good place to put our electrodes. We put our electrodes there and did what we could. So we were always in this other mode of training, which was actually the original mode in research. When the QEEG came along, in the early 90s, when it first became accessible to normal mortals, for something like $20,000, you were in business. At that point, it looked like manna from heaven for the people in the field. It says, okay, now we know how to do scientific neurofeedback, and it was almost, there was essentially no data. It was basically just a shift in the belief system. Well, this has to be the way to do scientific neurofeedback. Well, it turns out that the EEG reveals some things that are critically important to us, but other things not. And this gets to the critical issue. You see, in QEEG, how did it get started? It got started by A. Roy John, actually at UCLA here. He got involved in that when he was here at the Brain Research Institute, which is where just a couple of years later, my wife was working with her cats. So it was old physics. In other words, you extract from the QEEG those things that that are not only true today, but if you look at tomorrow, you'll find the same thing, right? In other words, the verities about that EEG. And it turns out, you see, that's the least interesting part. Yes, there's information there, and we do the same thing in fMRI and so forth. We find the verities, we find the steady state, connectivities and so forth, and that's of interest. But what is of far greater interest, you see, for psychiatry and neurology, is the dynamics, is the transient properties, and there we do our best in QEEG to squeeze that out of the data, right? And so the best stuff is on the cutting room floor. I said, wait a minute, what are we doing here? Right? You're very proud of having this verifiable data and so forth. But it's, you've left the good stuff on the floor. You've excised it out of the data. And the problem is, you see, that the dynamics are not easily reducible to good science, right? Because they're in the moment. They're situationally responsive. So how do you make science out of that? The problem is this: the brain is of irreducible complexity, right?
Right.
And you just confront that. It says, okay, so you're in various ways trying to put yourself in charge of the situation. Say, I understand this part of the brain and so forth, and I'm the expert here. And the fact is, you're not the expert here. This is far too complex an reality, and so we've emerged with this technique that respects the inherent complexity of the system, right?
And individuality as well. It sounds like too.
Right. So. So how does the brain recognize this amorphous signal? It recognizes it in the subtle fluctuations, which are where life itself reveals it. Life reveals itself in that signal, and so that low frequency is not of interest. It's the fluctuations that draw the brain's attention, and those fluctuations in that signal basically illustrate the role of that low frequency in organizing brain states, right? Which is the very thing that the brain is actively in charge of. So we're zeroing in on the thing that the brain is most interested in, right?
And giving it a reflection that it can see itself, because without that, you're it's the water you swim in, right? You're not aware. Like someone like me who has a high adverse childhood event score on the ACE scale, considered myself to be a quote unquote high functioning person until probably my mid 40s, when I first started to see the depth of the injuries. So one of the things that I think is so interesting about this infra-low frequency piece is tapping into this kind of steady state baseline that you're talking about of that. I'm curious, you're thinking about what sets up that baseline. Is it childhood experiences? Is it, there's probably some, what's the word, disposition in addition to that. How do you think about it?
Well, of course, this is essentially what has emerged, that this is the technique to get at the sequelae of adverse childhood events. So we're very much enamored of the work of Martin Tai here at Harvard, who has identified that these people with early childhood injury, really are fundamentally, their brain is fundamentally differently organized, and it's all in the functional domain. So we can retrain that, right? It's the basic structure hasn't changed. It's just what circuits are engaged and as part of the network, and what linkages are quiescent. So yes, what has happened is, as we get to lower frequencies, we're basically identifying the traumatized population. Now, the other realization is, you see, that it's not just a matter of ACEs, that it is, if a child is not brought up in a loving environment, right, it becomes already very aware of threat, and that already resets the threat posture of that nervous system. So any child that whose early childhood development is not overtly positive. I mean, neutral isn't good enough. If it's not positive, resolutely positive, then already that child's nervous system is adversely oriented to threat, and that has physiological consequences for the entire life.
Right.
And so, but it's all in the functional domain. So it's all trainable, and that is, of course, how we got there. We got there by working with adults whose constellation of cerebral function was basically set at early childhood. And so that got us into this. So we've been working on this model since the early 90s. And then in 96, we began to work with a person who had been involved with attachment disorder, which was reactive attachment disorder, which was the term we used at the time. Now it's just developmental trauma, and so that's the strong suit of this method. Now the nice thing is that led us to the realization that none of us get to grow up in a totally benign environment, right?
Right.
We all experience moments where we feel absolutely under threat.
Sure.
And so all of us are winged by this a little bit. The question is whether we're totally undone by it. Right. And so if we have a resilient nervous system, we manage to recover and go on. But so the world diverges, right, into the people who get to recover, and those whose nervous system continues to deteriorate and function over time. And so there's two streams, and so we can basically move the person from one population to the other, but it's much easier, of course, if you do this with children.
I'm wondering about a couple of things come up for me. One is, of course, adversity is necessary to build resilience. And, we know that from the swim tests, right, with the mice and the bucket and so on. It's the right dose of adversity with the right amount of resources to face the adversity, maybe is one way to say it, the recipe.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about a friend of mine in Vancouver, Gabor Mate, he's a physician in Vancouver who makes a big connection between the symptoms of ADHD and early adversity, and sort of the fragmentation and attention that would be adaptive in an environment where you are under threat, or you feel you're under threat a lot. And I'm curious if you see in this very low frequency training, do you see resolution of higher up issues, like maybe you would say ADD or ADHD, if you train the baseline?
Yes, absolutely. So what has happened is that in the early years, when we were trying to get this technique accepted, and our main focus was on ADHD, we adopted one of the standard assessment tools, which was a continuous performance test. And so everybody who came in got, if they were capable of taking the test, they got the continuous performance test. And so we established, first of all, that these core symptoms that we associate with ADHD are really across the population. This is how our attentional system fails, and it fails in depression, and it fails in anxiety, and it fails, in people across the board for all sorts of reasons. So So basically, ADHD is just should be actually a diagnosis of exclusion. Namely, you only use it when there isn't a better explanation. And
Right.
but of course, the problem is the reverse has occurred. It's a diagnosis that's easily given, and it then may overlook the very thing that Gabor Mate was pointing out, namely you may be really dealing with a trauma history and mislabeling it as just an ADHD problem. So yes, to get to the answer to your question, when we train the low frequencies, the higher bands also learn to behave, but there is still a payoff. The EEG band training has not disappeared out of our life, right? It still has merit. There's still a lot to do there. It's just it comes later. You have to kind of take care of the foundation of the house first. It's to cite a biblical metaphor here. Where the traumatized brain has built its house on sand,
right?
And so we need to take care of that before we take care of other things, and that needs to be recognized, and it will not be. You see, the practicing professions cannot recognize this until they have a remedy. Then otherwise, you just are waving. So as soon as we hand people this remedy, then the model will come alive for people. Then they'll say, okay, this is the way I need to look at the world. If you don't have that remedy, there's no point in bringing this up with people.
It's fascinating. One area that I've been following closely for some time now, and was involved in clinical research as well around using the kind of mind-altering drug MDMA to treat with psychotherapy to treat PTSD. There's a resurgence of looking at psilocybin and LSD and MDMA for these clinical applications. And there's a neuroscientist at Imperial College in London named Robin Carhart-Harris who has done really elegant fMRI studies looking at shifts in connectivity of networks on the acute psilocybin intoxication experience in the fMRI machine. And one of the things that the reason I'm bringing that forward right now is that it appears that there's a short-term introduction of entropy in the connectivity between systems in the brain. And this shift, this sort of chaos introduced into the system allows for people to, in some ways, have this mirror experience that you're talking about of getting outside of the point of view, the contracted, contorted, scarred down psychological perspective of the ego, and actually look at consciousness from a different perspective, or from outside of that difficult to get outside of perspective for a few moments. And so it presents an opportunity for perceiving the possibility of developing a different perspective about the things that have happened in your life and overcoming depression and PTSD and so forth. So I think it's really interesting, this parallel and some of this work that's happening in psychiatry around psychedelics and what you've done in terms of getting to the fundamental lower down issue of what's happening on the baseline of regulation or lack of regulation.
Right. Okay. So this is all valid, and we've been involved in that also for many years. Holotropic breath work.
Stanislav Grof.
Stanislav Grof. In fact, of course, he was a pioneer in the LSD work, and his hands were loosened from LSD by USA law, back whenever. And so then he turned to holotropic breath work. So it's absolutely valid. And it was wonderful work done way back when, Abraham Maslow and so forth, dealing with addictions with LSD, single shot effects, amazing. And that all went underground, right. For all those decades, because LSD became unacceptable. So, but the thing is this: there's a certain randomness and unpredictability there.
Yes.
And I know that gabo mate is latching onto ayahuasca and so forth as a remedy. I've been in the presence of gabo mate and so forth, but I'd love to engage your services in letting gabo mate know if you have that connection. He should look into this, because this is just a more systematic way, right, of getting to the same place, and therefore I think it's preferable. Now, not available to everybody. The psilocybins and the ayahuascas are more accessible, but this is just a more benign way to go, because it's systematic, right? Right. And it's orderly, and the brain is in charge. And also, there's the fact that the client sitting in the chair gets to say, this is me, I'm doing this. Right. Whereas with the drugs, it's there's an externality there. Right. He gets to take total credit, for resolving his or her issues and so forth. And it's just more humane.
Makes a lot of sense to me. And I don't think anyone would argue with you that ayahuasca, in particular, but really any psychedelic, is extremely unpredictable in what is going to happen for that person. And the level of skill that's needed in the guide is incredibly high. It takes a long time to train someone to be an effective guide with a psychedelic. And anyway, that's something that we're, maybe another conversation for another time. We're working on effectively training people to work with psychedelics in therapy for stubborn cases of depression with ketamine and trauma with MDMA and so forth. But the logic makes perfect sense to me of what you're saying, that working with this approach is way less risky and less unpredictable, and more, it sounds like you would say it's more uniform in terms of the impact on the person.
Right. So we're in a training model, right? So we give the brain, in the case of a traumatized individual, we're not going to be done in 20 sessions. That's going to be longer than that. And so the brain has a number of hours to experience itself in a more is living in a more regulated state and consolidating that state, right? So this is not something that occurs in the course of a 24-hour reset with ayahuasca. Right. So what we want is a healthy configuration of the neural networks. Right. And there is no instantaneous solution there. Yes, clinical progress is demonstrable and so forth, but and surely we see changes in connectivity relationships as well. But this nice orderly, you see, we take the brain to where the brain itself wants to go, right? To where it intends to go. So it maximizes the likelihood that the brain will find its way to where it should have been its entire life.
Right. So it's a teleological organizing principle that the brain wants to go toward order and self-regulation. I'm guessing because the level of energy expenditure is less for the brain to try to maintain disordered patterns.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But you see, that goes for the whole system. The traumatized system is running so inefficiently, right? In the autonomic nervous system, it's just working so hard. Right. Anxiety is a burden. It may be a relief to the person. The person believes, okay, my anxiety is keeping me alive, and indeed, that is a convenient belief. Comes to terms with what he has no choice about. He has no choice about living in anxiety. But now we bring all that down to a calmer state. In fact, calmness is the operative watchword for our work. The question is always to the client, do you feel calmer, more or less calm as we change frequency? That is the number one consideration. And then alertness, because it's calmness with alertness. In other words, it's appropriate vigilance, right? And so in order for the person to have the access to these resources, to be oriented to the outside world, that system has to be in a calm and well-regulated state. And that's the objective. So calmness is sort of the first operative word in our conversations with clients.
I'm curious about this calmness state. I personally grew up in an environment where appearing to be calm was highly adaptive, but behind the facade of calmness, anything but calm going on. And
right.
So I'm wondering, if you're presented with a case like that, can you tell the difference with this technology? I mean, how would you go about discerning whether it's an adaptive sort of strategic facade or genuine calm? Do you see it in heart rate variability, or how do you sort of confirm it in a way?
We do find the physiological variables that are traditional in biofeedback very useful to carry along here, but we have in fact found them to be of limited diagnostic utility. It turns out there's because we're in the moment, right? We're training the person is shifting state. The best evidence we have is what the person reports about himself or herself, right?
That's fantastic.
But we have to give them the vocabulary, because people are not used to tuning into themselves, and in fact, traumatized people. We worked with the larger some wonderful clinicians in Sweden worked with the torture victims from the Syrian war, and they don't want to tune into their bodies. They've learned not to to be just sort of disconnected from their physiology. Don't ask me about pain. Don't ask me to engage with how I feel. They're just in their heads. They just disconnect from that. So now we have to restart that conversation.
Right.
And many people, ADHD and so forth, they don't know what's going on with their bodies. And so that's one of the things that happens during the course of the training. The people learn to tune into themselves and report better. So there's all sorts of learning that goes on. The brain learns about the neurofeedback. The client learns about the neurofeedback, learns about himself, and the clinician learns about the client. So it's learning curves everywhere. So it's a complicated loop.
Mm-hmm. So in the future, as this evolves, giving the brain a mirror to sort of teach itself, really, to develop resilience and auto-regulation or self-regulation in the nervous system. I keep saying the brain, but really it's the whole organism, right?
Right.
Body. Do you see people being able to run their own training sessions, or what role does the technician play after the initial introduction?
We teach professionals. We've taught thousands of professionals, and all of them go home with the instruction: go there and train your own brain, right? And it turns out to be difficult to really take charge of your own training. And even if you're a good clinician with your clients and all of that, it's a challenge. So we do advanced trainings, and so people come back for that. And a lot of people really don't figure themselves out properly until they come back to the advanced trainings and then have another shot at it, where again other people are involved. And I know that my wife, is an obvious expert on this method. Training herself is also still a challenge. So it does help to have this other set of eyes. And I'm certainly, in my own training, rely very much on my wife as the observer, because this has to do with subtleties that one doesn't necessarily notice, but may be obvious to a partner. and longer term shifts, things that happen over not precipitously and abruptly in a session, but over many sessions. And so it takes the external observer to notice that actually things are different. And so often we have people go home saying, "Well, I don't think anything's happened," and then the wife calls up and says, "What have you done to my husband?"
Right.
So even with clinicians who do good work, it helps to have a clinician guide their training.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, we are relational beings after all, as social primates. So there's something to that of having the external pair of eyes on you. There's a lot of different dimensions of that, of course.
Yeah, so that's right. So there's a conversation there that's very much part of this, that there's this constant revisiting, how are you doing now? And that is a rich conversation, and ever richer as the process goes on. And so that, yes, illustrates the value of having that outside perspective.
Boy, the wheels are turning. I'm thinking about interesting possibilities of combining treatments with this low frequency training, and wondering, if some of the treatments we offer in our clinic would be accelerated, through the combined treatments. Have you done some of that? Have you guys done studies on combining the low frequency training with other strategies for addressing trauma and anxiety, depression, et cetera?
Well, clinicians do, but we are trying to play the role here of teaching this method. And therefore, we want to be very careful not to give the impression also that we're expert on other methods, right? Sure. So we very deliberately do not go there for fear of giving that impression that we have a comparable competence with respect to other methods, and we don't want to give that impression. But we definitely encourage our practitioners to combine methods. And of course, some of these combinations are obvious. I think, for example, we're dealing with traumatic brain injury and stuff like that, then it would be useful to combine this with hyperbaric oxygen therapy. Sure. And when we're dealing with the dementias, it's useful to combine the training with photobiomodulation, infrared illumination. And then, of course, nutrition comes into this, toxicities, dealing with toxicities and all of that. Right. So, but we don't venture there in our communications with our network practitioners unless asked, and then and even then we tend to be judicious in what we say. Sure. But definitely, there's so many things now that need to be brought to bear coming along. In fact, let me go back to this ADHD issue. Once we do the low frequency training, it is useful to go back to the EEG range and do what we did years ago. That hasn't gone away, and because now it has been potentiated. It's now very efficient to go back in the EEG range, where we used to have the whole job, right? But now we have a division of labor. We take care at low frequency what needs to be taken care of there, and then we go to higher frequencies and gamma band training and all of that. So that all still has a role, and now it goes very much faster once we've done the heavy lifting at the low frequencies. That's
fascinating. So fascinating. Wow, it's just been a delight to talk with you about your work and this deep discovery process that you've been in over decades. And I'm just deeply grateful for your contributions and for the opportunity to explore with you.
Yeah, well, I hope this garners some interest among your folks.
I'm sure it will. Thanks so much for your time and joining us on the show today. Would you like people to know any particular place where they could learn more about your work? What would be a good place for them to go?
Well, our papers are largely on ResearchGate. but then also our website, eeginfo.com, under research. The first few papers listed there are probably the major ones. And of course, I would also welcome questions, Siegfried at eeginfo.com.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Terrific. That's wonderful. Thank you. We'll make sure that gets into the show notes so people can go and find you and email you if they have any questions. One thing I like to ask people before we wrap up is kind of the same question for all of our guests, which is if you had a billboard and you could display a message that would be seen by every person on the planet, and you could put anything on there you wanted to, whether it's a word or a sentence or a paragraph, what would you like people to hear?
Oh my goodness. I would like, first of all, to have more time to think about that, because,
Sure.
As Churchill said, if I have an hour lecture, it takes me 10 minutes to prepare. But if I have a 10-minute lecture, it takes me all day to prepare. So, now you're shrinking this down to a billboard size. I just think the core message, which doesn't fit on a billboard, unfortunately, is that we're seeing a real breakthrough in mental health. And I would say, so the big message to people is do not stop looking for a remedy because a remedy exists. We can be so positive now about what is possible with regard to brain-based problems. This really is a new era. We're just staggered by what is possible with people who have severe limitations from even recovery from coma and dementia. I mean, just amazing. And you never know where this goes. It's just a question of plumbing for whatever the resources of that brain are, and they're highly variable. So basically, people should have a positive attitude about what is possible with respect to their own recovery, and not accept their status.
Beautiful.
Yeah,
I love that. Yes, and it resonates deeply, and the message of hope that we're in a new era now, and we have new possibilities to stay open to.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Sure,
Othmer.
I really enjoyed this. Thanks for giving me this opportunity.
Same here. It's been really lovely, and I feel like it's the beginning of a longer conversation, perhaps. So I look forward to that.
Yeah, good.